We need to isolate memories that generate stronger negative emotions.
A sequel series to Star Trek had launched to good viewing numbers, but was still overshadowed by the original series, thanks to a lack of both good scripts and good beards.
The quality of the transmission is very poor.
At the very least, one of those things would change in Star Trek The Next Generation Season 2.
When I stroke the beard thusly, do I not appear more intellectual?
In 1987, Star Trek had been resurrected as a syndicated television series, a show with an all-new cast and a new spaceship. The first year, though, had, well, to be polite, many issues. But people kept watching anyway. When the still fresh series returned for a second season, it was pretty much more of the same, yet somehow also less of the same.
I do not know what that is, sir.
Season 2's production was delayed by a writer's strike in 1988, with a shorter 22-episode season being the main result.
Likewise, where the hell was I headed?
Dr. Crusher was gone and would be replaced by a new chief medical officer, Dr. Pulaski.
Yes, for now.
But the biggest and most important change to the series was that Riker had grown a beard.
I don't mean to be indelicate.
Some people will tell you that TNG only became its own thing in the third season, but it would be a disservice to the series to underplay the massive impact that Riker's beard would have on the show. If you're flicking through the channels and The Next Generation is on, but you don't know which episode is playing, well, does Riker have a beard? If no, well then that's the first season. You can probably change channel, go and watch Jeopardy or something. But what if he does have a beard? Well, then you have a roughly 1 in 6 chance that it is a second season episode.
Baby needs a new pair of shoes.
Which, at the very least, does have a fair few good episodes sprinkled throughout.
Say goodbye, Data. Goodbye, Data.
In trying to get production up to speed quickly after the end of the writer's strike, an old script for the abortive late 70s Star Trek Phase 2 was given a quick rewrite in order to give the crew something to do while new scripts were worked on. By quick rewrite, we mean change some character names around. Phase 2 had, of course, had new characters, Decker and Ilea, who eventually appeared in Star Trek The Motion Picture, and would also form the basis for Riker and Troy, but there was also a Spock replacement, Zon, who more or less turned into Data. So it's easy to see how just renaming some characters in the old script gave producers just enough runway when they couldn't get a fresh script ready to go in time.
I'm going to have this baby.
An alien entity enters Troy and impregnates her while she sleeps, which does sound like about 90% of Troy fanfiction.
Something which I can only describe as a presence entered my body.
A child is born and seems to grow at a vastly accelerated rate in just a few days. It's pretty ho-hum in general, very ho-hum as a season opener, less ho-hum since it gave Deanna something to do, other than look like she's got cramps, and less ho-hum because it introduces Dr. Pulaski. Yes, they got rid of Gates McFadden, or she left, or they consciously uncoupled, or whatever the PR speak is.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah, for a later discussion.
It does suck that Crusher was replaced, but Pulaski is one of the best characters this season.
With all your neural nets, algorithms, and heuristics, is there some combination that makes up a circuit for bruised feelings?
Diana Muldaur was a favourite of Roddenberry, having appeared in Classic Trek a few times, as well as one of his 70s pilots. Here Muldaur played a cranky old-school genius doctor, and one not prone to playing footsie with the captain. Also on board as a semi-regular is Guinan, played by Trek superfan Whoopi Goldberg, who was a pretty big movie star at the time.
Well, everyone's very curious about you. Yes, I'll bet they are.
Guinan tends bar in the new 10 Forward set, and let's be honest, will make a far better therapist than Troy ever really is.
Make it so, number one.
Despite our crew saving the Federation, the Galaxy or the Universe each week, Starfleet has been shown to be incredibly stingy about promoting our main crew. Geordi is promoted to a full lieutenant and officially becomes the ship's chief engineer.
Chief engineer. It still has a nice ring to it.
The extra bits with all the comings and goings, we're not talking about the Troy bit, are decent enough, though there's not really a lot of dialogue explaining much of any character growth, neither personal nor facial. And the whole idea of the alien exploring humanity by being born and then dying, and then of course never being mentioned again, does seem kind of cruel to Troy. It's good for Marina Sirtis to be given something to do other than just calling random people on the view screen liars.
We've checked everything. There's no reason for this to be happening.
One thing you'll notice about the second season is that in all bar a few episodes, even when something happens, nothing really happens.
Somewhere out there, Something will happen.
Where Silence Has Lease sees the Enterprise being observed by an all-powerful creature in space, Nagilum, who wants to study humanity, but he's probably going to end up killing half the crew in order to do that. Rather than submit, Picard sets the ship to self-destruct, and we watch everyone count down to their doom before Nagilum blinks. Well, it's not as if he could pat his head while rubbing his tummy. It's just a nothing episode, with the only remotely interesting thing is that they wanted actor Richard Mulligan to play the character, even naming the creature after him by spelling his name backwards. In the end, it was played by actor Earl Bowen.
That's incredible. How can you play it like that?
Merely throwing myself into the part, Watson.
Data gets to play Sherlock Holmes, Geordi gets to play Dr. Watson, Pulaski gets in on the cosplay, and Daniel Davis, Niles the butler from The Nanny, gets to play Moriarty. In the original series, if you'd wanted to do a Victorian England set story, you'd have to use the highly unsatisfying conceit of a planet that just happens to have developed along parallel lines to Earth, where everything was almost exactly the same. Now that we have the holodeck, we instead have the highly unsatisfying conceit of it going wrong because some numbnuts turns off the safety protocols. This is like driving a car without the brakes, or never changing your password ever since you had it tattooed on your arm. Hey, I can hear what you're saying, but it is easier to remember it that way. Data starts off by ruining the mystery, solving it in the first 30 seconds, with Geordi annoyed at his friend ruining everything. Like somebody who brings a guitar to a house party.
The first time anyone opens their mouth, you've got it solved, so there's really no mystery. If there's no mystery, there's no game. No game, no fun.
While the idea of the holodeck going wrong is really dramatically unsatisfying, the actual episodes that result have often been highlights, so what the hell do I know? This is a pretty solid ep that lets the cast have some fun.
Which enabled me to deduce that Mr. Jabez Wilson was headed here to meet a most distasteful and untimely demise.
When you watch The Next Generation, you notice a lot of people in the background, someone playing a small role here and there. A few really big stars, but a lot of people who would just play supporting roles in various dramas and sitcoms. Here it's Anne Ramsey, who'd later be a regular on Mad About You. Having spent a tidy chunk of change on building a Victorian London set, the studio then tried to save money by compressing the shooting schedule. In the end, the production got made, and is one of the nicer looking episodes of the season. We'd seen Data profess admiration for Sherlock Holmes previously, whether it's just for comedic effect or whatever, but Brent, Spiner, Levar, Burton and Diana Muldaur seem to be having an awful lot of fun, which mostly transfers to the viewer. After it was broadcast, Conan Doyle's estate was not pleased, threatening legal action if the Holmes character was used again. Moriarty, though, would return. Sorry, excuse me. A moth flew into my mouth. But yeah, he'll be back without Sherlock Holmes.
I come from a town so small, we had a fraction for a zip code.
Outrageous O'Connor is almost a Seinfeld episode, in that it is about nothing. There's a charming rogue O'Connor mixed up in a Romeo and Juliet diplomatic incident. The Enterprise picks up O'Connor, who everybody seems to dig since his life sounds so much more interesting than what's happening on the Enterprise this season. He's wanted by the leader of one planet for getting his daughter pregnant, and the leader of another planet for his own reasons, and then it's clear that those two space youngsters belong together, and then O'Connor goes on his merry way. Of minor note, Rosalind Ingledew would later appear on Sequest, and as a minor background crew member, Terry Hatcher. The B story is Data trying to learn about comedy, which has Joe Piscopo appear as a holodeck comedian who is even less funny than Data. They originally wanted Jerry Lewis but settled for Joe Piscopo. In 1988, they would have been ecstatic to get Joe Piscopo. I mean, oh man, it's Joe Piscopo. But now it's, oh man, it's Joe Piscopo. I saw a movie with Joe Piscopo in it once. Billy Campbell, later to be the Rocketeer, was originally the first choice for Riker, except the studio head John Pike saw the actor audition and declared, "I would not follow that officer into battle." Ouch. This is the Trek equivalent of Thomas Magnum treading water for an hour, except that was good. So here, pray for sharks.
The guy says, I want a second opinion. The doctor says, okay, you're ugly too, but boom.
It's a symptom of the season, just nothing happens, the B story being so amazingly disconnected from the A story that neither feels remotely satisfying. It's not irredeemably bad, it's just there's so little of note. O'Connor was written to be a charming rogue in contrast to the Starfleet officers, and then the character was never heard from in live action again. Over to you, fanfiction.
I told a joke. And? No one laughed.
Loud as a Whisper is about Federation negotiator Reaver, who can't hear and his main method of communication is via a chorus, who get nuked pretty quickly. Deanna tries to help Reaver retrain, but he's finding it too hard. This was inspired by deaf actor Howie Seago suggesting a story where he would, of course, play the main guest role. It's well intentioned if a little slight, but then it does fit in with the mostly unambitious nature of this season. Schizoid Man just gives you the feeling that the show really did not want to commit to fixing major parts of the crew's backstories. Data meets a dying mentor of Data's creator, Dr. Sung, who claims that makes him Data's grandfather. Ah, Jesus. Morgan Shepherd is wasted in a very blah episode.
I can safely say that to know him was to love him.
It's the only time Vulcan Dr. Salah was ever seen, despite being mentioned on occasion. It's a rare Data episode that's terrible. Unfortunately, it's also not going to be the worst Data episode. Unnatural Selection is a Pulaski episode where she's infected by something that's causing people to age rapidly. She recruits Data to help as he's the only crew member who's immune. It's been said that the main problem with Pulaski is that, in trying to recreate the love-hate relationship of Spock and McCoy, Next Gen's producers overlooked the fact that these characters in the original series gave as good as they got.
It is pronounced Data.
Oh?
You called me Data.
What's the difference?
One is my name. The other is not.
Data, on the other hand, has no guile, and so Pulaski just comes across as a mean-spirited cranky pants who's gotten out of the wrong side of the bed, run out of coffee, and just stubbed their little toe on the corner of the shower. I hate it when that happens.
Forgive me again.
And Colomini's character finally got a name.
This is Chief O'Brien, sir. Almost ready.
Here's a story that feels painfully out of place this season, because it's pretty good. Riker accepts a temporary transfer to a Klingon ship as part of an officer exchange. Here we get to know how things actually work on a Klingon ship. Whereas previously we'd had the impression that they just spent all day trying to kill each other. Well, here we have confirmation that that's exactly what it's like on a Klingon ship. Which must make collating 360 staff reviews a much more interesting task.
I'm your captain now.
Good Riker episodes would become as rare as holodeck episodes where safety protocols being overridden has no downside. Brian Thompson, the go-to big guy who can act, possibly appeared in every major genre franchise over a period of decades.
Sentimental Lieutenant Worf.
Efficiency, Commander.
Here's an episode that really deserves to be in a better season. Measure of a Man is one of Trek's finest episodes ever.
Data is a toaster. Have him report immediately to Commander Maddox for experimental refit.
A hearing takes place to determine whether Data is the property of Starfleet, where if he loses, a scientist will be able to disassemble Data to see how he ticks, and there's no guarantee he'll be able to put him back together again. Look, I once took apart a priceless antique grandfather clock to see how it ticks, and look, well, to cut a long story short, it don't tick no more, and it ain't worth shit.
You're still a pompous ass. And a damn sexy man.
Picard's ex is the judge. Picard has to appear for the defense, and Riker is blackmailed into acting as a prosecutor, which does sound like what happened the last time Auntie Beryl hosted a Tupperware party.
What is he then? I don't know. Do you?
Measure of a Man's other contribution, it was the first time that we would sit in on the semi-regular poker game played by the senior officers. It might seem a little cheesy, but the poker games finally managed to humanise these characters in just these short scenes, more than had been the case in most episodes to date. Also, Data wearing the green eye shade was always a cute touch, even though he's the only one who's guaranteed not to get eye strain.
Does Data have a soul?
The Dauphin is, well, Wesley falls in love and gets to first starbase, which apparently is a Sunday in 10 forward. But his girlfriend is actually a shape-shifting creature protected by a helicopter nanny shape-changer, which really does sound like the premise of that series idea pitched by Glenn A. Larson,
Helicopter nanny shape-changer.
It also has a random appearance from a pre-Twin Peaks Madchen Amick. Contagion is another episode that we'll describe as slight. It's basically a computer virus that threatens both the Enterprise and a Romulan ship, and because it's the second season, the solution is to just turn it off and on.
We turn her off and effect a wipe of the Amato log, including every subsequent event since we downloaded it.
Carolyn Seymour was the original star of 70s British sci-fi series Survivors, and you'll notice her popping up a few times in American series around this time. She'd go on to appear as various characters throughout Star Trek in the 80s and 90s, and if there's a High Priestess character in a video game, there's a better than even chance that it was voiced by Carolyn Seymour. Contagion's main claim to fame, it's the first time that Picard utters his famous drink order from the replicator.
Tea, Earl Grey, hot.
Earl Grey is controversial in that, as a tea drinker myself who doesn't like coffee at all, I would rather have a coffee than a cup of Earl Grey. There are many different types of tea. Earl Grey is just one. Some people like Earl Grey. I like Yorkshire tea. But then again, so does Patrick Stewart. I mean, obviously, he's from Yorkshire. Yorkshire tea is not actually all that old as a brand, and it's also, well, obviously, not grown in Yorkshire. So here is a blind taste test. One of these cups has Yorkshire tea, one of them has Earl Grey, and one of them has a cup of horse urine. Oh, that's piss. The Royale is basically a holodeck gone wrong story that's not set on a holodeck. On an alien world, the crew finds an Earth casino, but one that seems based on a trashy novel. It's just so slim and slight that a marble wouldn't roll off it, but it's a fun enough episode. A low-stakes episode, no pun intended. Writer Tracy Torme had a tough relationship with the head writer Maurice Hurley, and this script was written, rewritten, de-written, and put into production as a budget-saving cheapie, and Torme would eventually take his name off the script.
Filled with endless cliché and shallow characters.
Tracy Torme would leave the show this season, but his rancor would continue indefinitely, where in his own show, Sliders, he would base a number of less than flattering characters on Maurice Hurley. A damaged shuttle pod has another Picard in a fragile state. The evidence points to this other Picard having abandoned the Enterprise just as it's destroyed. This is the sort of show demonstrating how the series at this point just didn't want to commit itself to big ideas, anything that would have any impact beyond this week's episode.
We both want the Enterprise to be safe, but there is a piece of information I don't have. What is it? It's me. You.
Of course, Picard didn't scarper, leaving a yellow streak behind him as a way to track him. Or did he? No, he didn't. Or did he? No, but he didn't.
I'll need a little more time.
Well, we're really reaching for the stars here, aren't we? Riker's been offered a command on a far-off exploration mission, and before he's even said yay or nay, his estranged dad, Kyle Riker, shows up to brief him. Well, I wonder if they're going to come to some understanding with each other by the end of the episode.
I've been hearing some good things about you. And why haven't I heard from you?
Oh, and Kyle Riker has a history with Dr. Pulaski, which would certainly put into context certain unusual remarks made by Pulaski during Will Riker's last physical.
I would have.
But this is quite a dull episode, with the big face-off between Riker and Riker Sr. covered in hockey pads and belting the shit out of each other because somebody saw something similar on The Prisoner. Worf's B story, where he goes through a Klingon rite of passage, which is of course people beating the shit out of each other, seems to be there to fill in time, but for whatever reason, one of the Klingons is played by John Tesh. Data has secretly been corresponding with a child on a planet that hasn't achieved warp technology, which is a big no-no as far as the Prime Directive is concerned. It gets worse when it looks like the alien kid's planet is going to be destroyed. Oops. And the kid is played by Nikki Cox. Also, Wesley is put in charge of a science team and has to deal with his own insecurities about older officers not taking him seriously. Meanwhile, I had to deal with my own insecurities and inabilities to make a decision when given responsibility for finding something to watch on movie night. I've so far spent 9 hours trying to find something to watch on Netflix.
Quite impossible.
I think I've narrowed it down to Back to the Future, a documentary about Back to the Future, and a documentary about John DeLorean who made the car that was in Back to the Future.
It is no longer a matter of how wrong Data was.
So far this season, more often than not, ambition has been sorely lacking in storylines. Almost always watchable, but even in an era of episodic series, we have received more filler than a rusted-out Yugo.
That's not possible.
Take it easy, Wes.
But here we have Q Who, head writer Maurice Hurley's single greatest contribution to the series. Q shows up to once again taunt Picard and offer himself as a crew member. But after being rebuffed, the Enterprise is flung off into a far-off part of space in order for Q to show the crew what they would be in for.
On screen.
The ship encounters a cube-shaped vessel in deep space. And yes, this is where the Borg first show up. The Borg send single units over to investigate the ship and quickly adapt to Starfleet's weapons to the point where Picard has to basically beg Q to send them home.
I need you!
The Borg would turn out to be one of the greatest foes in the Star Trek universe. But here they're so deadly, Picard has to grovel in order to avoid having to make a 2-part episode.
If you can take a little bloody nose, maybe you ought to go back home and crawl under your bed.
Samaritan Snare sees Picard and Wesley share a shuttle to go on a long trip. Picard has to have an operation on his artificial heart, and Wesley uses the opportunity to get to know the usually aloof and closed-off captain. It's a little bit like being stuck on a long car ride with Derek from work, where you have to stop yourself from making small talk with him, lest you ask him about his dueling scars. Picard actually decides to have a conversation with Wesley, which I don't think anybody saw coming. I mean, here's a captain who doesn't like kids, and at one point was outright hostile towards Wesley, and here he's just chatting away, telling Wesley how he acquired his artificial heart. I mean, we would actually see those events in the story much later on. It is great stuff from Will Wheaton and Patrick Stewart. It also does beg the question, if you had to go on a long trip in a shuttle, Who would you prefer as your travelling companion? Wesley, Picard, or a write-in candidate? Meanwhile, the Enterprise is dealing with a race of creatures who seem to be not the brightest LEDs on the BMW turn signal. The Packlids seem barely able to log into their own bank accounts, let alone being able to get a ship into space.
We are smart. We need their computer things.
So they decide to hang on to Geordi since he's useful. For a Nothing Much Happens episode, it proves to be quite engaging and builds up some of the characters in ways that won't immediately be forgotten the following week. Picard's operation goes wrong when he hires the lawyer guy from Murder One as his cardiologist.
I'm not qualified.
I know someone who is.
No, not them.
We are smart.
And Dr. Pulaski shows up to save the day.
Saving your life.
Up the Long Ladder is a show that some folks really hate. Enterprise has to transport two vastly different colonies to safety. One colony live like stereotypical Irish village peasants, while the other are technocrats who are dying out. Apparently, they were once told to go f*** themselves, and they misunderstood, thinking they should reproduce themselves by cloning. Riker, Pulaski and Geordi are a mite annoyed when this bunch of clones try to nick some of their DNA. Why are they so angry? Well, I suppose it's a matter of consent. Now, you think it's bad when a store puts you on their mailing list and you get sent reams of junk mail offering annual discounts on subscriptions to their hair lice treatment.
That's what I call a wee drop.
Meanwhile, Riker is washing the feet of a woman who's been walking around all day in goat poop in the cargo bay. Now, depending on your point of view, that's either a first date or something you really should bring up the next time you see your podiatrist. Honestly, I don't mind it. It's a little silly and unambitious, but that was pretty much this season's logline. Star Trek The Next Generation Season 2. A little silly and unambitious. Speaking of which, Manhunt is another really forgettable entry. This has to be the closest thing to a Love Boat episode in Star Trek. Lwaxana has entered a time of life when her sex drive was redlining.
Your Commander Riker and I will be joined in the union of matrimony.
Picard inadvertently accepts a dinner invitation when he realizes far too late that he is the main course. Even with Data running interference, Picard needs to hide out somewhere, and the holodeck seems ideal, where he returns to his favorite Dixon Hill novel. Meanwhile, at the periphery of this episode, some alien ambassadors are being transported and something's fishy, and I don't just mean their diet. The alien intrigue plot is so far in the back of the minds of the writers that it's mostly forgotten about until Lwaxana reads their minds and reveals their murderous plans. Oh, and one of the aliens is played by Mick Fleetwood. Manhunt is forgettable. Like the time I was... what was I saying? The Emissary sees another ex showing up. This time it's Worf's ex-girlfriend, the half-Klingon, half-human ambassador, Kayla. She's finding it hard to keep control of her Klingon half. After the pair have an erotic encounter on the holodeck, I mean it is cheaper than a motel, Worf wants to make their friends with Batleth's arrangement permanent. Susie Plaxton had already appeared earlier this season as the Vulcan Dr. Selar, and would make Kayla a popular character despite only making a few appearances on the show. It's a good solid trek, and one of the few this season that would have any bearing on later episodes. This week's random crewman who'd later be a well-known face, Diedrich Bader. Peak performance is a little episode where Riker is given a tired old ship to use in war games with the Enterprise. Then there's the rather arrogant master strategist Kohlrami, who Data challenges to a game of spaghetti fondling. When Data's past interfering skills are no match for Kohlrami, Data goes into a funk thinking he's malfunctioning at Noodle Nonny.
You're supposed to be infallible.
Obviously, I am not.
Then, during the war games, a Ferengi ship mistakes the simulated battle for the real thing, and for some reason decides something's up. Okay, it's Armin Shimmerman again, but you can tell the Next Generation was cursed when it came to having the Ferengi as any sort of serious threat. Then Data gets his groove back by managing a draw in spaghetti fondling. And spaghetti fondling would, alas, never once more appear in Star Trek, an infamous episode. Riker cops an injury on an away mission, and in sickbay his condition gets worse. Troy and Pulaski can only watch in horror as Riker gets sicker and sicker, while the audience gets sicker and sicker once the realization hits that this season finale is a clip show. What can you say about a clip show other than, I get the need to balance a budget? Riker's subconscious conveniently only relives moments that we've already seen since the start of the series.
The infection will spread to the brain within an hour.
It's so very ordinary, and it would be the last time that we would see Dr. Pulaski, with future mentions of the character conspicuous by their almost but not totally complete absence. They never took the ironic step of having her killed by a transporter accident, Though in hindsight, having her fall down a turbo lift shaft would have just been delicious.
But I don't think that's very likely.
The second season's behind-the-scenes dramas weren't much better than those on the first season, and as a result, many episodes just ended up being very ordinary. However, we did at least get a few episodes that could be described as excellent, and a few more that were pretty good. There is good and there's bad news. The good news is the show would improve markedly with the next season.
Assuming we're not too late already.
The bad news, we aren't talking about that in this video. That's a story for another day. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.